I used to think when I was doing recipes that I was providing an advantage to these bloggers by saying the recipe steps are numbered. And so, nice and organized and orderly and efficient. And then I realized I am just making extra work for them. They have to take each one of those numbers out when they copy it over to their recipe card.
Wow.
So you do not need to number or bullet.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Pretty Focused podcast. We are going behind the blog with Erin Gearhart of State of Dinner. Now, some of you guys might know Erin as a Pretty Focused grad, and we've definitely have done her interview before. So you can find that on our blog and on our YouTube channel. But today we are talking to Erin as a blogger. And you might be like, she's a Pretty Focused grad and a blogger? Yes, she is. And so, Erin, before we kind of dive in, I would love to hear, that transition of like why as a blogger you joined Pretty Focused and kind of what your business looks like today.
Awesome. Thank you, Melody. It is always so much fun to chat with you. And so I'm glad to be here. I started my blog, State of Dinner, back in 2020. I had no idea that thousands upon thousands of other people were starting blogs too, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. I had been put on furlough from my job because of the pandemic and thought this would be a really fun way to get my kids in the kitchen. My blog started out kind of being iconic food from across the United States. And so I was taking my family through, hey, what are the things that Idaho is known for, and teaching my kids geography with that, teaching them home ec skills with that, and blogging my way through.
I love that.
It was a lot of fun. It's always been a lot of fun, but in the beginning, these dinners that we would do were just really special times for my family. And I was fortunate to have, as with a lot of people who were in a similar position, took full advantage of unemployment during that time, which helped kind of keep my family afloat while my job was in limbo. That job ended up being eliminated. They closed down all of the U.S. operations for my company, and I needed income, right? Like things were turned completely upside down. I didn't want to have to leave my family in that time because it was still really uncertain what was going on in the world. Needed to be able to be home, helping my kids through their online schooling. And a year and a half later, so thank goodness for extended unemployment, a year and a half later, that was coming to an end. And I was looking at, do I go back to work? Do I try to, I have this little side hobby thing that I'm doing. Do I try to make that into a business? And lo and behold, scrolling through Instagram, I saw Pretty Focused. And I thought, that's something that I can do in the interim. Like one day I would love to be able to blog full time, but I'm not monetized now. I'm not making a single dime from it. And how cool to be able to learn my photography and enhance my photography skills while making an income. And so I decided to invest in the course, went through it as fast as I could, but it was a lot bigger learning than I anticipated. So valuable and so incredible. The way that it took me from somebody who had never owned anything more than a point and shoot camera to somebody who is doing photography for bloggers full time. And several months later, timed strategically on my part, but also very fortuitously, the month that my unemployment ended was my first month as a Pretty Focused photographer.
Wow.
So it allowed me to have an income. It allowed me to stay home with my kids and to support my family during this uncertain time, while also continuing to build my business, my own personal blog. And I ended up working as a photographer for about 2 years. And it was a lot of fun. I worked with some wonderful bloggers as my clients. And then I also developed and sold recipes as exclusive recipes for bloggers. And it met that need in a really fantastic way, offering me that flexibility and allowing me to, I remember after I graduated telling my parents, the only limitation that I have is me, in my time, like as much money as I need to make, I can make as long as I have the time to do it. And so that was such a gift. And then, last January, the end of 2023, I realized I was at the point in my business now, having monetized and grown my business, that I needed to really focus on that, and in order to get it to where I wanted it to be. And so I ended up stepping away from doing photography for others, and now just focus on my business. And so I still utilize those skills that I learned in my own blog. I really do credit the photography that I have as a part of what has helped me to be successful in my business now too. So, it served me really well in 2 different ways, in 2 different seasons of my life.
I love that. There were so many people in 2020 who we just had, there were changes everywhere changes. But one thing that my husband is now staying home. And once he came home, once they closed the doors, we realized, what have we been doing?
Yeah.
And you just see this whole other life that can be lived. And we learned that there actually is another way. And just since then, we've resolved that it's a life worth fighting for.
Absolutely.
It's
something that I never would have taken that leap, or had the courage to take that leap.
Yeah.
So sometimes those really hard, scary times give you a really big blessing that now I'm totally with you. Like, I would fight for this to continue to be able to work for myself and to prioritize the things that I always said were really important to me, but I never had the courage to make important. So.
Yeah, I love that so much. So you've gone from, this and other bloggers join Pretty Focused to do the things that you said that you did. They join because they want to make money as they grow their blog. And that's exactly what you did. As your skills improved for your blog, as you grew there, as you were able to bring in income during that time, and now you have your business to this point, and you're like, okay, now it's time to shift my focus 100% back onto blogging. And that's just such a smart business move. We can get into all of the things about how important it is to narrow in your focus in business and everything, but that's what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Is you're just focusing on your blog. And so how has it been this last year, 100% working on your blog?
It has been really good, as far as very rewarding, also very scary. Again, the thing that is kind of the negative of only working on my website and that business is the uncontrollable. So as the pro of being a photographer that I mentioned, of I can make however much I need to make, time is my only constraint. Now I am at the mercy of so much else. So got hit right after making that decision to focus on my blog, got hit with the Google algorithm last March. Half of my Google traffic taken away, really trying to figure out, okay, can I just rebuild or get this income from somewhere else? And so a lot of trial and error there. Or do I need to go back to doing photography? How do I make this work? And it was a lot of frustration as well. But through utilizing different things like, Pinterest did really well for me in that time, and some other traffic sources, and then just continuing to put things into new recipes, modifying how I was doing things, continuing to learn and adapt and change.
Yep.
Now that Google income has come back up, I'm actually up over last year.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
I'm starting to see that circle again. It is something that I think if you're going to be a business owner, whether it is photography or whether it is blog or whether it's a completely unrelated business, you have to anticipate ups and downs and highs and lows. And you have to know that it's not always going to be smooth sailing. There's going to be different times where you have to pivot, change your business model, learn new things. Sometimes when you don't have the income that you thought you were going to have, and how are we going to navigate through that? And it is incredibly stressful, but it's also part of business ownership. So
I know,
that's been this year.
Like, keep your big girl pants on, like you got to have big girl pants.
Yeah. Well, and I know a lot of people who decided to no longer blog when all of that happened in the spring. And, so many people selling their blogs, and now not everybody has recovered, but many people have. And I'm so glad that I didn't give up during that time, because now I am seeing the fruit of sticking through all of that. And I know that that's going to come again. There's going to be other times in my future where Google tanks or Pinterest tanks or AI changes things. But not just continuing on, which is one piece, but continuing on and looking at how do I need to pivot, and what do I need to do to navigate this next season of this business, I think is the key.
Yeah. Well, I think the book by Jim Collins, Great by Choice, talks about what you just described, and that every business owner in every market everywhere is going to have ups and downs.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like what you just described, what he described, like the 20-mile march where you just kept going, right? Yeah. Like you were steady and you were consistent and you figured out, what it took. And so you hear about the people selling their blogs or stepping away, and you're like, oh my gosh, wow, they did. That seems so scary, maybe for somebody who's thinking about being a photographer for food bloggers, and they hear that and they might kind of like, well, hold on just a minute. How steady is this? And you have to realize though, that a lot of industries and a lot of markets can go through, situations like this, and then understanding that. And then first of all, realizing that you don't know the stories behind the reasons as to why they left, how was their blog, were they optimized for SEO? Were they, you don't know all of those. You don't know the story behind the story is what I'm trying to get at. Right. So
you don't. And in addition to that, restaurants close every day. That doesn't mean that people who serve restaurants, restaurant supply companies should question whether or not they're going to have enough business, because there's other restaurants that are opening every day. That is just business. Businesses open, businesses close, more businesses open. And as long as you are meeting the need of your consumer and providing a good product, you're going to have a business. Now, those business needs may change sometimes. And so you have to keep your eye on things so that you can adjust to those needs. But you're going to have a business as long as you are meeting that need.
So let's talk about now, let's kind of shift and talk about how photographers can provide their clients with a great product.
Yeah.
You know, when you think about being a photographer for food bloggers, you think the product is great photos. But whenever we kind of dive in, there's a couple of different maybe aspects or avenues that people can go to. They can, you know, photograph existing recipes. We call those recreations. And then there's another side where bloggers or photographers are actually writing and developing recipes, just like you said that you were doing, developing recipes for food bloggers. So in that case, the product is not just photos at that point, is you're also providing a really great recipe. Right. And, you know, the question around what recipes do the clients want, that's like never ending, right? So I don't really want to focus on how to find the best recipes. What I kind of want to talk to you about is how to provide a great product, like with the recipe itself, like the written document, the thing that digital copy that they are sending over, because I think there's some elements to that we can often overlook, or maybe we just don't know. So I want to talk about that right there. Like, how can they provide a really great product with that written recipe, regardless of the recipe? Yeah. Right. Regardless of that, because that is a whole other thing, keywords and everything. We're not getting down. We're going to get down that.
You know, I love talking about keywords.
I know
you're not going to let
me. You absolutely do. And so let's talk about the recipe itself. Yeah. So first of all, when you are doing recipes, like, what does that, like, I have to write recipes? Like what does that all entail?
As far as developing the recipe or writing the actual recipe down?
Let's touch on developing just a little bit. And then let's really talk about the written recipe.
Yeah. As far as developing, I mean, there is a lot that can go into that. Like, we could talk for hours on just developing the recipe, but a couple of things that I will say is, number one, the recipe, when you're selecting a good recipe, should be both familiar and different. And what I mean by that is, it's really important that you are bringing in your own creativity, your own skill set in recipe development to create a recipe that is not just a carbon copy of other recipes that are out there. I know we've got a whole course with Pretty Focused on how to do that if someone's wanting to develop that skill. But, you know, not something that is super weird, but something that is unique and different from what is already out there. And then that recipe has been tested multiple times. The recipe, number one, first and foremost, has to work. It has to be a recipe that the blogger can feel confident in providing for their readers, that their readers are not going to have problems with it, that they're going to enjoy the recipe. So that is like the foundational. I always love opportunities when I have somebody else making my recipe. This isn't, feasible in all cases, but sometimes when I'm working on a recipe, I'll have, my husband makes it then, or my sister makes it. And then I am able to see, this thing that I thought was really clear isn't really clear. And so even though when you're developing as a photographer, you're probably not going to have the luxury of having multiple people make it because you're trying to get that product out to the bloggers, but thinking through the eyes of somebody who's never read that before. And so making sure that the way that you're writing that recipe is really clear and really simple, as if somebody who has never cooked before, look at it through that lens, so that you can make sure that it makes sense for everybody. You may know what you mean when you say a pinch of salt, but that person making it, that a pinch is different for everybody. And so instead of that saying, a scant 1/8 teaspoon, or thinking about somebody who's never cooked before, I think about one of my favorite iconic scenes from a TV show with Schitt's Creek, where they're talking about fold it in. How do you fold it in? And what is, you fold it in. People who don't cook don't know what folded in means.
No.
They don't know what so many of these terms mean. And so being able to break that down and be more specific, take that spatula from the bottom and fold it over the top, giving those specific details. A blogger who purchases your recipe can always adjust that information if their readers are more advanced, but it's important to write those instructions so that they're easy to understand. There's not confusion. And that way, not only do the readers know, but there's no question with the bloggers also. If you're saying, cook it until it's done, versus cook for 5 minutes until the edges are golden brown, that level of specificity will be important so that both the blogger and the readers know very clearly what the expectation is.
Because then it's not just, time, it's also what it's supposed to look like, because there's variations in the oven settings. And that's also why photos are so important, is because it really shows what that final result is supposed to look like. And so
it does.
Yeah.
And, always including things like the mixing speed when you're using a mixer, not just saying beat it until, but what speed should they be beating it on? Obviously the oven temperature, but also the stove temperature. Is it medium or medium high? So many times when I'm cooking other people's recipes, they'll just say, boil on the stove to this point. Well, what temperature should it be to get it to boiling? People who don't cook don't know that. They feel lost when they look at that recipe. And so giving them those specific details, even when you think about measurements, 1 onion versus 1 cup of finely chopped onions. Some recipes that doesn't matter. You could have 2 cups of onions, or you could have 1 cup of onion, and it'll still be a good recipe. But others it does. And so being very clear there in that amount. Also the order of how you put the ingredients, or put that ingredient matters. So 1/4 cup of chopped basil is very different from 1/4 cup of basil chopped. Which is it going to be? That could end up having a different result for the recipe.
Yeah, it's so true. And so also obviously correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Whenever you do like 1 cup of onion, isn't that better? Because your recipe plugin is also calculating calories. Right. And so, you can see the nutrition facts on everything. And so I think you get a more accurate, I just know from calculating my own macros, you're going to get a more accurate caloric count if you're doing 1 cup of onion versus 1 whole onion, because what is that?
That's
small
absolutely
onion, medium
true.
onion, large onion. And so if you can be specific there.
It will still calculate 1 onion, but who knows what their size of onion is that calculation is based on. Another example of that is with garlic. If people are using fresh garlic and they say 1 clove of garlic minced, well, I don't know if you've seen, like, the cloves of garlic could be tiny or they could be gigantic. So how much do I actually want? That is going to make a huge difference in flavor. So,
and I use jarlic. I am not going to lie. I am not ashamed of it. And you have to use a lot more of that stuff. So I'm like, what would be a couple of cloves? I'm like, tablespoon, 2 tablespoons. And so just because it's just so much faster, so I'll do that. And that
I
makes
want to say too, when it comes to those measurements, making sure, check and double check those amounts. So that you can make sure that they're accurate. I've seen recipes where it says it says 1 stick of butter, and then parentheses, a third cup. Well, a third cup and a half, 1 stick, those aren't the same thing. And so which is it? So making sure that you are checking for accuracy. Sometimes it's just, you hit that wrong button on your computer and you don't even realize it. When you're reading through, it all makes sense to you because you're reading what you know is there instead of what actually is there, what you know the recipe to be instead of what actually is there. And so even have somebody else read through your recipe if you've got someone close by who can say, does this make sense? Are there any weird things like the third cup of butter when it's really a stick or a half cup? They can check on all of those things for you.
Yeah. And it should say 1.5, right? Do you prefer 1.5 or like 3/4 of a cup of butter or 1.5 sticks?
I personally prefer the cup measurement. So like the half cup or 1.5. I don't remember what you just said.
1.5 sticks.
1.5. So yes, I prefer 3/4 cup of butter versus 1.5 sticks. For my own blog, I will put the sticks in the parentheses after, in the notes part of that ingredients, just because some people do that.
They measure in
that works
sticks
in their head. But the cup measurement is universal. And so somebody in the UK, their stick size is different from the stick size here in America. And so they need that. They actually need grams, but they understand cups versus they put in it's a different amount.
Oh my gosh. Speaking of grams, like I love measuring in grams. Anytime I see a recipe there that has grams listed, I'll measure in grams. But I did notice on a recipe that I love, and I want to check into this one more time, but she said half a cup of sugar is 100 grams and a half a cup of brown sugar, 100 grams. And I was like, ooh, so I measured out 100 grams of brown sugar. It ended up being more like 3/4 of a cup. And I was like that. And I was thinking, oh yeah, that's not, you can't 100, like a half cup is not 100 grams for every item.
Nope. Absolutely right.
So I was like, oh my gosh. And she's anyway, so the grams, so I love grams. I know it's so funny whenever I see all these comments about, because I follow, bloggers who are in New Zealand and they put the grams on there and they do a lot of really great bread recipes. So you have to have the grams on there. And the comments that they get on their blogs are hilarious from mostly Americans who are like, why can't you use real measurements? And they're like, I'm giving you the most accurate measurements you could possibly get. And so I love the grams. So I think that if you can use grams on your recipe, you're really, I think is really beneficial. And I know a lot of bloggers like grams. I don't know if you put those on your blog or if you just use.
I love grams. I think most bloggers that are buying your recipe would want you to, if you're going to put grams, also have the cup version of that. But I absolutely love grams. I will say the one thing is you'll see some variations in amounts. So for example, with your brown sugar example, I would be putting 110 grams for that half cup. A lot of people, flour is 120 grams as the standard, but I and some other bloggers will do 130 because that's closer to how people actually using cups, what they will actually get. They never get 120. And so you will see a little bit of some variation there, but I think it is, I say that as far as the variation to say, don't get too confused if you see some variation. The difference between 10 grams of flour is not really going to impact a recipe. It is so minuscule in the actual amount. So don't get too hung up on that. But also, if you're going to put grams, do the actual measuring yourself so that you know what went into that recipe, because when people make it following the grams, they're going to need it to be the result that you got, right? And so
exactly, yeah.
Measure it with the measuring scoop and then weigh it so that you know exactly what it is.
Yeah. So if a photographer wanted to start adding grams into their recipes, like how do you do those conversions?
So you can find online calculators that will do those conversions. Again, you will see some variations with them. So you'll want to get a scale yourself and figure out which online tool matches what you use. And then, what I have done is just, I will do my own measuring for all of the basic ingredients. And so I know what a cup of flour is, what a cup of sugar is. I'll compare that against the online calculators and make sure that I'm measuring properly, so that I'm not way off, right? And so for example, 200 grams for a cup of granulated sugar. If I am measuring granulated sugar and I'm getting 225 grams and every other calculator says 200, I know that I am off and I need to make that adjustment. So measuring, and then over time you will learn those yourself. And so it becomes really, really easy to be able to, a teaspoon of baking powder is 1 gram. So that's
look at you go, which people don't necessarily do the teaspoons and tablespoons.
No.
Unless it's salt in like a bread recipe, because that makes such a big difference. The salt does. And so you can get online calculators, but the most important part is if you're going to be using grams is to make sure the recipe is tested using the grams that you specify. Because the result can be absolutely different. So like I did, I will on certain blogs that I know are really good, Sally's baking blog is great. So I won't even, and this is what I love about it, I don't even get out my measuring cups. I just put the bowl on the scale, and you should be able to do that. Just put the bowl on the scale.
Right.
And just measure. But this other recipe, I'm like, oh my gosh, I almost added way too much brown sugar.
My kids don't even know how to use measuring cups because I am a scale.
Because you're all scales. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
I'm teaching my boys that as well, like using the scales and how to measure with grams and everything. Because I just think I like grams so much better.
I do too.
Everything just comes out more consistent every single time. But now let's talk about, so that's like a lot of development. Holy cow, we just talked about a lot of stuff. So I hope that everybody listening is getting a lot from this and you're taking notes. But let's talk about like the recipe itself whenever it comes to writing the recipe, because there's a little bit of a skill involved here. So let's talk about maybe the formatting or the elements of a well-written recipe. So, let's talk about like what should be at the top of the recipe. I mean, handing a recipe into a blogger, what's a blogger going to expect?
Obviously, the very first thing is the title. That is important for you. It's obvious when they purchase the recipe, but you also want to make sure that it is there on the recipe page itself. So there's no confusion. They know this is the recipe that goes along with this recipe.
They're in the right place.
Title, right? That is also something, if you are doing keyword research, you'll want it to be like your main, the title would be your main keyword that you're recommending they focus on. They're going to do their own keyword research and determine exactly, but that's what you've developed the recipe for. It also needs to have the number of servings, and when appropriate, the batch size. So for example, if you're doing a dip, you could say this dip serves 12 people, but then what is that? Like, that's very subjective as far as like how much per person. So what does it make? Does it make 2 cups or does it make 1 cup? So including that amount. Cookies, you may say, again, it makes 24. Does that mean that it serves 24? Does that mean that it makes 24 cookies? Or does that mean that it makes 12 cookies and you're expecting everybody to have 2? So anytime that there's like a sauce or a dip or something like cookies, make sure that you're putting the overall batch size, not just the number of servings.
Not like serves one batch, one batch of cookies serves me on a very lonely night or something. It's like, no, it's your batch makes 24 cookies.
Yep.
I've seen those really off where I'm like, I definitely got 36 cookies, or I got under, and I use like just the normal, also the scoop size. When you're writing the recipe and you're doing cookies,
you're writing the recipe,
you have to have the scoop size because that makes such a big difference. It also affects cooking time. So
how many tablespoons? I just realized I've always realized this a while ago, but when I was making cookies, I would say use a 2 tablespoon scoop, and then I actually poured water into my scoop and realized it's 1.5 tablespoons. So I had to adjust, how I'm communicating, and that's part of why the batch size is off, right? So make sure that you're using the correct, or that you're telling them the measurement that you're actually using, so that they know.
Good tip. Maybe that was my problem.
I had something else really important. And
I'm sorry. We were talking about batch size and serving size.
Another thing, this isn't what it was, but another thing to include there is the prep and cook time. That, again, can be wildly off because I am going to chop an onion way faster, sorry, Mom, than my mom does, because she moves very slowly in the kitchen. But it is something that people look for, right? Mm-hmm. And so what time should they expect for this to take, for prep and for cook? It's something that is in almost every recipe card. And so it's really challenging for a blogger to they can do it, but it will not be as accurate for them to look through your recipe and go, okay, what is that going to take as far as prep time? If you can supply that for them, that's really helpful.
So say you have a yeast recipe, right? We're going to make some homemade bread later on today. And so does the prep time include the rise time? Like, how do you specify that on bread? So, it needs to rise a total. You got the prep time, which is 10 minutes. And then it's an hour first rise. And then you put it into the baking dishes, right? And let it rise for another 30 minutes. So that could be almost another 2 hours. Mm-hmm. So is that all included in the prep time?
I love that you brought that up, because that's one of my pet peeves when I am looking at bread recipes. Is I'll be scanning through, maybe I need bread in 3 hours and I'm looking for something really quick, and I'll get halfway through making this recipe that says that it takes 2 hours. And then I'm like, oh no, this is supposed to rise overnight for 24 hours. What? So definitely include that, but include it separately. And so prep time would be anything that is like measuring, chopping, mixing, general browning of something perhaps, okay. But and then the bake time, or total cook time, and then include rise time as a separate line item there. Or if something needs to be chilled, chill time would be a separate item. Most recipe cards have where you can customize an additional time slot and then have it all total up for the same amount of time. So you're giving the blogger the information that they need there in order to be able to provide. They can determine, am I going to put that chill time under prep, or am I going to separate it? But you're giving them exactly what they need in order to make that decision. Okay, awesome. I love that. That's good to know. So the prep time, but then rise time or chill time, specify that. And then you got your bake time. It takes 25 minutes to bake the bread. That's pretty straightforward. Or it takes an hour to bake the lasagna, whatever. Yep. So, okay. So we have the title, and we have the cook time, and we have the servings. Now we have the list of ingredients. Is that what comes next? List of ingredients comes next. And I will say that the things like the servings and prep time and stuff, I don't think it matters too much whether that is the first or the last thing. You can put, depending on how you want to format your page, as long as all of the information is there. And then, yes, the list of ingredients, and the ingredients industry standard for the ingredients is that they are listed in the order in which they are used. And then sub importance to that is quantity. And so if you have, for example, a cup of sugar and 3/4 cup of brown sugar, and they're both going into the recipe at the same time, you would list that 3/4 cup second because it's a smaller quantity than the cup of granulated sugar. But you would list them both before you listed the flour, because flour is something I'm going to be doing next. Think about efficiency for that reader. So if they need to make a sauce or a marinade and have it sit, or they need to do something and have it cool down, that should be, even if they are adding it towards the end of the recipe, they need to make it first, list that first, and then list the other things. And so just think through, what is the order in which I'm doing this? And then, one area where you'll find a lot of adjustments based on quantity is in seasonings. And so a teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of garlic, a 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper. Those would be listed in order of quantity, even though they're all entered at the same time.
Okay. All right. So you have like the sugars, you got your 1 cup of butter. I'm just going through my cookie recipe. You've got, 1 cup of white sugar, and then, 3/4 cup of brown sugar. And then you cream those so that goes in order. And then, so your dry ingredients, same thing, because you mix all those together. So you've got your 2 1/4 cup of flour, your teaspoon of salt, your teaspoon of baking soda, and you put it in that order. You don't put like the teaspoon of salt, teaspoon of baking soda, and flour at the end. Yeah. So kind of what goes together, you start with the larger quantity and then work your way down to the smaller one.
Right. And you'll see on different recipes, cookies specifically, you'll see some people list those dry ingredients first and some list those dry ingredients as the last. And that's because some people prefer to mix their dry ingredients, have that set aside, and then work on their wet ingredients. And some people do the opposite. And so that's a personal preference. But just think through, like, what are you doing? What makes sense as far as efficiency for the reader?
Yeah.
And then put them in that order.
Mm-hmm. Now, should be bullet point. Are these numbered? Yeah. How do we format? Let's talk about formatting of the ingredients.
It should be 1 ingredient per line, not bulleted. And so that way the blogger can copy and paste that from your document into their recipe card. Each line is going to be read as a separate ingredient by the recipe card, and then plugged in where appropriate. And so when you put bullets, that's just something extra that they're going to have to remove before they hit submit for the recipe card to read it, that program to read it. Same with the instructions. I used to think when I was doing recipes that I was providing an advantage to these bloggers by saying the recipe steps are numbered. And so, nice and organized and orderly and efficient. And then I realized I am just making extra work for them. They have to take each one of those numbers out when they copy it over to their recipe card. Wow. So again, the steps should be on separate lines, separate paragraphs. And that program will read, the recipe card program will read each paragraph as a separate step and then input it where it needs to go, but you do not need to number or bullet.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot. I mean, that's even less work for us because sometimes formatting can get like a little funky. So that's great. That's great. It's actually a little bit more simple than formatting wise than kind of what you think. And you think, I am adding so much value because, like you said, I'm so organized, but really it's actually just creating more work for your clients. This is one of those things that as a photographer, it can help you stand out. If you are just making, bloggers are coming to you to purchase recipes, to make life easier, to get more work done. And if you create more work for them, they are not likely to return.
Right.
They're going to make note like, oh, I had to do too much work on that photographer's, recipe. So I don't know if I'm going to purchase from them in the future. And so these are the things that you can do to stand out is you shouldn't have to make the blogger do work twice, purchase it from you and then they have to go and fix everything. That's not what you want.
And that brings up another point. Make sure, use a program like Grammarly. Make sure that you are, your sentences in your instructions are at least somewhat grammatically correct. So that they can just copy that. They don't have to reword that unless they want to. Some bloggers like to reword, put it in their own words so that they know that it's original instruction. Yeah. Some just want to copy and paste that in and be done with it. And so keep it as easy as possible for them by, you can do a plugin now where that's all automatic. Grammarly checks your stuff automatically.
Great.
Or you can just go over to Grammarly.com and copy and paste it in there. Either one works, but that is an easy way to make sure that you are doing that little extra that's going to make you stand out, because it will minimize that work. And then putting it in a document where they can just copy and paste it. So again, you may think, oh, I'm going to put this in this nice fancy PDF file, so I look so professional, but that creates extra work for them. So, whether it is Google Doc or it's Word, that you're putting it in something that is editable, that they can just highlight, copy, paste, and be done.
Copy, paste. Yeah. Yeah. And I know we have like one grad who is like, oh, I do a PDF, I do a Word, I do Google Drive, I do Pages. Like she hits all 5. And I'm like, cool. Just as long as you're not creating too much work, because your clients only want one of those, and so,
and
she's
chances are every blogger has Google. So like, even whether they're a Mac, whether they're a PC, whatever. So if you want to put the time and effort into creating multiple versions, have at it. But Google Doc is probably going to 99.99% of bloggers, you're going to be meeting them right where they need to be met.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then I think one piece that photographers have to add, and this is something that bloggers have shown up in my inbox saying, can you please tell them to do this? And that is putting their name and contact information on the recipe. So on the footer, on your recipe template, whatever, like just have it there. Don't just put your business name, put your name.
Mm-hmm.
That is such a pet peeve of mine, is whenever you don't know somebody's name. And it's like you are building relationships with people. That's another way you stand out, is you're not just providing products, you're building relationships with people, and you can't build a relationship with somebody if you don't know their name. So make sure they know who you are. You know who they are. So they need to know who you are.
Right.
And then your email. And then if you want to, your phone number. I know that there've been bloggers who appreciate that, because they can be like, I'm getting ready to hit publish, and like, I have a question about this. And so if you feel comfortable, you can do your phone number, if not just your email address. So,
a couple of other things I just remembered as far as things to include on that recipe card. Number one, when you're writing the measurements, to use the full word and not abbreviations. Tablespoon, teaspoon, that eliminates a lot of confusion, especially if you're doing small t, big T. Food bloggers know what a small t versus big T is, but it just eliminates that confusion. Many readers don't know. So the blogger will want to put on their recipe card, teaspoon, tablespoon. And again, you're saving them from having to type that in manually by putting that in. And then take advantage of that notes section on a recipe card. Bloggers are often trying to include, they want to be able to have, if somebody's going to print off that recipe, their reader's going to print off that recipe, that they would have all of the helpful information that reader would need to know in order to make that recipe successfully, right there in the notes section. So make sure you're providing that information. Any kind of key substitution information, storage, any kind of helpful tips, that you are including all of that as well, so that they have the information they need to help their readers make it successfully.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to go back to ingredients because I thought of another thing. So you're going to list out the ingredient, you're going to say the whole name, right? But you also, whenever you describe like the butter, it's like 1 cup butter, comma, softened.
Yes.
Or comma, room temperature.
Yes.
Or, 1 clove garlic, comma, minced. So you wouldn't say 1 clove of minced garlic. You're going to say 1 clove of garlic minced.
Yep, exactly.
So even those descriptions are the same, or are need to be ordered in a specific way.
With the exception of if that measurement is the already done. So if you're doing 1 cup of chopped onions, or another pecans, let's say 1 cup of chopped pecans versus 1 cup of pecans chopped. It's like the basil ingredient the example that I gave before. That would be the time to put the chopped before or the minced before. But if it's a whole ingredient like the garlic, that goes after.
Okay. And like the butter.
Or like the butter, the softened butter, melted.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's
1 cup of, with butter, it's the same, 1 cup.
Yeah.
Melted
but the chopped, but a whole 1 cup of pecans whole is different than 1 cup of pecans chopped. So
yes.
Okay. Love that. Okay.
Different amount of grams.
Okay, so let's just real quick touch base on this notes section that you just talked about.
Yeah.
Notes, we call this FAQs,
Yep.
frequently asked questions, right? How can you, what's the difference between a weak and a strong FAQ section? What are some of the top questions that food bloggers want answered about that recipe?
So frequently asked questions would be anything that will help a reader to successfully make it, or would help them to troubleshoot. So definitely storage and substitution is a part of that valuable frequently asked questions. Also things like, what do I do if my sauce is too thin, or why might this pudding not set? Those kind of troubleshooting. How do I fix this? Things. Things that are not helpful are like, what is the difference between white chocolate and dark chocolate? What is the difference between
milk chocolate and dark chocolate, or something?
Chocolate and dark chocolate. Like these things that readers really aren't asking on this recipe. So a recipe does not need to be the full encyclopedia of all things related to the recipe. It needs to be, how do I make this recipe successfully? One great way to find FAQs is looking on other blogs of a similar recipe and looking at their notes section, not their FAQs. You can do that, but they may or may not have relevant FAQs. Look in their notes section and see what are other people asking, what are their actual readers asking, and answer those in that section. So how do I know my cheesecake is set? Yeah, that might be a helpful FAQ, but how do I know that my cookies are done? That's not as helpful because that's subjective, right?
Right. I like them softer,
So yeah, just really thinking about that recipe and the troubleshooting or the helpful information for that recipe, and not the extra stuff around it. We don't need to know in an FAQ the origin necessarily. People aren't really asking about where chocolate chip cookies were invented. When they're looking at a chocolate chip cookie blog, they just want to know, how do I make this chocolate chip cookie the best chocolate chip cookie that I've ever had? So keeping it relevant to that recipe, the storage, freezer information, if it's something that could be frozen, that is helpful. Reheating information is helpful.
Yeah, I I've seen like a lot of, they'll list out the ingredients and, like in the blog post itself and kind of talk about like why the olive oil over the butter, like why you chose that. And so, or why regular milk versus buttermilk. I think
Yeah.
like a Christmas morning casserole that I had that, on there, like why they use milk versus buttermilk. And it was just because they used milk in the biscuits instead of buttermilk because they were already using milk in the casserole. And I was like, well, that makes sense because then people don't have to buy two different milks.
Right.
I still want to use buttermilk in the biscuits. So, and also ingredient swaps, like, flavor variations. So like when you're doing the chocolate chip cookie, swapping out milk for dark or, adding pecans or my favorite, brown butter and bourbon, like
Yes, mine too.
so good in chocolate chip cookies. You can add those variations, but then you also though have to be very careful if you're going to do ingredient swaps, say like a chocolate syrup for like a fudge, right? Those are two different consistencies. It could create, if you're doing like sometime like an ice cream cake or whatever, it can create two different consistencies and you could get two different results. So if you're going to do an ingredient swap, you need to know that ingredient swap is going to work.
Absolutely. I would say a big area on that is gluten-free. If you haven't tested it gluten-free, don't suggest a gluten-free flour as an ingredient swap because they have different requirements. It's not even a 1-for-1 gluten-free flour is not always 1-for-1 where you don't have to do any other modifications. And that's something I see often is use to make this gluten-free, use 1-for-1 flour. Well, if you haven't tested that, you can't make that recommendation.
Yeah. I mean, so what you could do is, and I've seen bloggers do this and I love it because people ask those questions. Can I do a gluten-free swap? And so I have not tested this with a gluten-free 1-to-1 flour, but if you try it, let me know. And a lot of times the readers will try it and let them know. And then they can adjust those notes and be like, I haven't tried this, but several readers have tried it.
Exactly.
And it works, so good luck, so I think being transparent with some of those things is okay too.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I would say as far as the recipe developer is concerned, if you are developing this recipe for a blogger, your credibility is important. So make sure that don't fake it. Just to provide content into that recipe. If you have experience or that something works, whether it is for this exact recipe or I made almost this exact recipe in a different version, and that's great. But just know that your credibility is important, and so only speak to substitutions that will produce a similar result. So, swapping, for an example of this, I know based on all of my baking that I can swap a half a cup of applesauce for a half a cup of oil in sweetbreads. And so I can make that recommendation if I want to reduce oil because I've made so many different sweetbreads, reducing the oil by adding a half a cup of applesauce. I don't have to necessarily test that specific recipe. But if I'm going to make brownies and sub half cup of applesauce, I probably want to test that because there's different ingredient variations that will go into the result of that. And brownies are fickle anyway, but so
also you have to have expertise. You have to have the melted butter to melt the sugar. Like it's a whole thing with the brownie. It's a whole thing. But I really, I think that's really great. And the thing that we have to remember as photographers working for food bloggers and you're developing recipes for them is just, when you talked about credibility, because I want to go back to, I always say you have to understand the end result. You have to understand your client's business so you can serve them well. Photographers, you have to understand that a blogger has built their business and their reputation on their recipes. That is why people come to them. That is why they're ranking on Google. That is why they build an audience. They have built trust with their readers. And so the trust that their readers have with them is the type of trust they need to have in you, that they can just copy and paste one of your recipes, put it out there and know that it works. Because that's what they're investing in. Like this, we've talked about this, before internally, but for bloggers, recipes are an investment. They sometimes don't see a return on their investment for, I don't know, Erin, a year. Sometimes it takes it or more. It takes a long time for them to see a return on their investment. So when you understand that they are truly investing, they don't have the traffic yet to that recipe, right? Yep. They don't know. And so they have to, it's an investment. And whenever you make an investment, as just as a person, is that you want to be able to have faith and trust in that investment. And that's what makes it easier to invest again and again and again, is whenever they can see a return. Now, the great news is I love whenever I hear from bloggers, like I buy recipes and I see a return on investment every single time. Like somebody said, like, I was just going to buy a couple here and there, but once I saw I could always see a return on my investment, I kept buying. So we definitely hear those stories. Yep. But I also want to stress just how you can stand out as a photographer whenever it comes to providing this type of product, not just photos. Yes, we want killer photos. Yes, we do want to do that. But if you are, selling exclusive recipes, it has to be executed so well, because it's not just your reputation, it's your client's reputation. And if you can continue to help build your client's reputation, that is how that you are going to create lasting customers and people who are just going to keep coming back and back and back. So
I can guarantee you, if you are the recipe developer and photographer who is delivering that recipe where they can say, every time I make a return, they are absolutely coming back to you. They are waiting with bated breath and their alarm set for your postings to be listed, because they cannot wait to make that purchase. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are, I know we didn't touch a lot on, recreations, we really focused a lot on exclusive recipes and developing, recipes. I'd say if you're doing recreations, providing additional notes, how you can stand out to your client is like, well, this recipe was already made, I didn't write it, but if you can, as you make it, you can create notes for them on the recipe of how it tasted and what your experience, was with this recipe, being able to give them as much information as possible. That's how you can stand out as somebody who just does recreations. And so I hope that you took this information. This was not just, I know we focus a lot on recipe creation. Yes, I know that, but there's so many pieces that even if you don't do exclusives, that you can take this information and run with it. And those of you who are listening, you're like, what are they talking about? What's an exclusive? What's a recreation? Am I going to have to develop exclusives? So what I want you to do, if you haven't done so yet, I want you to go through the Pretty Focused roadmap, because we really break this down of what it's like to work for food bloggers. We talk more about exclusives. We talk about recreations. We give you examples of what that looks like. And I even walk you through some behind the scenes on what it's like to do this at home. So I've got all of the links in the comments below if that is something that you want to learn more about. But Erin, holy cow, you're like one of my favorite people to talk to.
Oh, I love it. You're one of my favorites.
Those of you, if you don't know, Erin was a coach prior to kind of stepping away and then going 100% into her business. And so she still is so active in our community, and I still consider her just part of our team. She is now on our teaching team, and we have, she's written a keyword learning lab, and you're going to see more from Erin in the future. Cannot wait to see what she has in store for you guys. It's going to be so great. But thank you for joining us, Erin, for another episode of the Pretty Focused podcast. We'll see you guys back here for the next episode.